There's no reason at all that Ukraine should be the punching bag for the Russians, and the Ukrainians not being allowed or have the ability to respond, and that's exactly what they're doing.
There's been some quite dramatic events over the last couple of days. Russia's defense ministry says it has thwarted a Ukrainian drone attack after it downed 2 drones over the Moscow region. 2 others were intercepted over the Bryansk region, northeast of the Ukrainian border, it added. Flights were stopped to and from Moscow airports on Tuesday, the ministry said. And airspace above Moscow has actually closed several times in recent days as reports of drone strikes become more regular. Well, Colonel Brendan Kearney, military affairs analyst and former chief of staff for U.S Marine Corps Forces in Europe, joins me now. Give us an insight into what the Ukrainians are planning to do here, because it seems like this has caused some major disruption.
It has, and I think that's exactly what the Ukrainians want. It has very little tactical significance to the ongoing fight on the ground in Ukraine. But what it does is it adds complexity, it adds headaches to this dilemma that Russia finds itself in right now, where it's not doing well, either on the ground or now clearly in the eyes of its own citizenry. If they can't defend Moscow, how are they going to defend the rest of Russia from these UAV attacks? Even if they are tactically insignificant, it's quite I think it's an emotional, it's a moral issue, and one that the Russians have got to be concerned with.
What do you make of the ambiguity around these attacks? Ukraine's not claimed responsibility for any specific drone strikes. But Zelensky said previously that attacks on Russian territory are an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process.
There's no reason at all that Ukraine should be the punching bag for the Russians, and the Ukrainians not being allowed or have the ability to respond, and that's exactly what they're doing. I think that the question of the ambiguity of it all is that the Ukrainians have been very circumspect in how they have carried out the attacks into Russia. There have been some small civilian casualties, but nothing like what the Ukrainians have suffered at the hands of the Russians. And again, this just makes life hard for the Russian Air Force, their Air Defense Command, obviously for civilian traffic too.
Well, you raise an intriguing point there, because we heard, didn't we, about this flagship Russian, I think it was a long-range bomber that was destroyed by a Ukrainian drone strike. There were images, weren't there? I can't remember the name of the plane. I think it was a Tupolev Pro south of St. Petersburg. And yeah. Moscow said that a drone was hit by small arms fire, but managed to damage the plane. Again, Ukraine didn't comment. But that was potentially a significant hit, because that was a long-range bomber, and that is what the Ukrainians have been planning to target more often.
That's exactly right. And the thing is that the Ukrainians, by their silence, and they have been early on here, I'd say months ago, when they started to ramp up their drone attacks, they started to hint around that some of this was occurring because of disaffected Russians who side with Ukraine. And that has got to cause Putin a real headache if he's got a third column going on inside of Russia. And I think the Ukrainians are wise not to claim credit. Just let the thing occur and just be silent, smile, nod their heads, and wonder how it's taking place.
Well, how much evidence is there of disaffected Russians going over to fight for Ukraine, Brendan?
There has been some. Early on, there was some reporting of some sabotage efforts that were going on inside Russia. Those again came up earlier this past summer. We started to hear about it again right around the time that the Russian announced that they were going to go ahead and increase the conscription, because that is probably the biggest sore point for the Russian population. They don't want their sons being drafted. or their husbands being taken off, when they're in their 40s and 50s to join the Russian army by force. So that has been out there. How accurate the reporting has been on it is pure speculation, certainly on my part. But I would think there's enough opposition to what Putin has done that there could be some things like that going on inside Russia by Russians.
And I suppose it's difficult also to know the effects of what these drone attacks over Moscow are doing to the population in Moscow, who now live under a greater cloud and threat of war than they did 6 months ago.
Exactly. And again, it's worrisome to the Russian people. It certainly strikes at their confidence in their own government and their government's ability to defend them. So this is something that can't be ignored. The Russians are going to have to spend some scarce resources in terms of additional maybe radar units, anti-aircraft units, if not just aircraft, that they're going to have to station around Moscow and other key cities in Russia to try to prevent the Ukrainians from being successful. And again, these are pinpricks, but they carry an inordinate message that affects the Russian people and the Russian leadership and the military. It's embarrassing to their military. So this is well worth the effort that the Ukrainians are going to if they're the ones completely responsible for it.
I wanted to talk to you briefly before you go about the situation with the Wagner group, because the Wagner chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has appeared in a first video address since that failed mutiny in Russia. And it looks from the images and what he was talking about that he was actually in Africa. What do we know about the latest relationship between the Wagner group and the Russian military?
Hard to say. My gut feel is that they hate each other. And they're contemptuous of each other. And of course, Prigozhin has been very, very vocal in the past in his criticism of the Russian military leadership. Not so much of the Russian soldiers. I think he holds them in high regard, but he sees them being sacrificed because of the incompetence of the leaders. But I think this Africa thing. He's got a number of operations going on in Africa, and that's a moneymaker for him.
Yeah, Mali, Central African Republic.
Absolutely, that's a cash cow. I also believe he's in Venezuela, and of course he's had an ongoing operation in Syria for. He's been committing crimes against humanity down there for a number of years.